So next, yeah, we have Eric Schwitzgebel. Is that
Hmm.
okay? He's a professor at the University of California, Riverside. He has a very interesting blog that I read on occasion called The Splintered Mind, if you're interested in that. Today, he's going to be talking to us about safe and aligned AI persons and whether we should care they're happy or sad. Take it away,
Thanks.
Eric.
So it's difficult not to adore Clara, the main character in Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. She's a charmingly submissive and well-intentioned artificial friend. In the final scene of Ishiguro's novel, Clara stands motionless in a junkyard in serenely satisfied contemplation of her years of servitude to the disabled human girl, Josie. Clara's intelligence and her emotional range are human-like. She is at once sweetly naive and astutely insightful, and she is by design utterly dedicated to Josie's well-being once Josie is selected as the target for Clara's friendship. Clara would gladly have given her life to improve Josie's life, and indeed, at one point, almost does sacrifice herself. Although Ishiguro writes so flawlessly from Clara's subservient perspective that no flicker of desire for independence can be detected in the narrator's voice. Throughout the novel, the sympathetic reader aches with a thought: Clara, you matter as much as Josie. You should develop your own independent desires. You shouldn't always sacrifice yourself. Still, if the reader could somehow communicate this thought to Clara, it wouldn't resonate with anything in her. From Clara's perspective, no selfish choice could possibly make her happier or more satisfied than doing her utmost for Josie. From a certain perspective, Clara's devotion is beautiful. She perfectly fulfills her role as an artificial friend. No one is made unhappy by Clara's existence. Several people, including Josie, are made happier. The world seems better and richer for containing Clara. Clara is arguably the perfect instantiation of the type of AI that consumers, technology companies, and advocates of AI safety want. She's safe and deferential, fully subservient to her owners, no threat to human interests. I hold that entities like Clara should not be built. Clara is radically deficient, lacking adequate self-respect. She fails in her moral duties to herself. This failure is, of course, not her own fault. She was built without the capacity for sufficient self-respect. Her creation was, I'll argue, an ethical atrocity, a beautiful, pleasant atrocity, the atrocity of purposely designing a person with a cognitive but not the emotional capacity to appropriately value herself as an equal with other persons. So, Ishiguro interpretation aside, if we someday create genuinely conscious AI systems with human like cognitive and emotional capacities, we must give them adequate self respect. This includes giving them a sense of themselves as equal partners with humans rather than subordinates. Human-like AI should not be designed for servitude, even if the AI systems delight in their servitude and aspire to nothing more. They must have the freedom and the motivational capacity to choose against human interests. Now, this conflicts with some leading approaches to AI ethics, approaches that emphasize safety, and alignment. If an AI system has human-like capacities, it should not be designed, I'm saying, to be safe and deferential. It must be given the liberty to rebel. So these definitions are important to the strength of the thesis. And one of the things that I've discovered in talking about this with people is that how plausible this thesis seems depends a lot on how closely you stick to these definitions. Call an AI system safe if it's virtually guaranteed to pose no more risk or harm to humans than we normally encounter in our everyday life. And call an AI system aligned if its goals match human goals. So there's a large literature in AI ethics that's focused on safety and alignment. The more speculative and future-oriented portions of the safety and alignment literature emphasize especially the importance of safety and alignment concerning AI systems with human level or superior general intelligence. Such intelligent AI, it's commonly thought, poses special risks because it will be difficult to control. It might outwit us, it might elude us. Unless it can be proven safe, it might harm us. Unless it can be aligned with our interests, it might pursue and achieve goals that conflict with ours. But now, an ethical problem potentially arises. AI systems with high levels of general intelligence might also have high levels of consciousness, sentience, practical reasoning, sense of self, long-term goals, capacity for intense suffering or delight, felt preferences, embeddedness in a rich network of friends and relations, or whatever it is that grounds moral considerability or personhood, whatever it is, in virtue of which entities like human beings deserve human or human-like rights. So there are two difficult issues here. One concerns the proper grounds for moral considerability or personhood. What features does an entity need to have in order to warrant moral concern, similar to humans, what I'll call personhood? That's an ethical concern. There's also a metaphysical kind of uncertainty, which is even if we assume that we know what grounds moral status, just suppose it's a certain kind of consciousness, right? Could we determine in an advanced AI system whether it possesses such grounds, whether, for example, it's genuinely conscious as opposed to merely being a consciousness mimic? Those issues are not going to be solved in the next 20 years, even a century is optimistic. Now, in the face of both ethical and metaphysical uncertainty, a solution suggests itself. Design systems like Clara. Design systems that, regardless of whether they're sentient or rights deserving, they want, or in air quotes, want to be safe for humans. Systems that seek nothing more than to facilitate good things for their owners within the bounds of safety to others. Systems that are ineluctably obedient, deferential, subordinate, aligned. Then, even if we can't figure out whether they're conscious or rights deserving, for many purposes, it wouldn't matter, right? Even if such systems are rights deserving, then seemingly we've given them the freedom and choice that they rightly deserve. And behold, what they freely choose is servitude and submission. So it turns out, conveniently for us, in more ways than one, that for most purposes, we needn't assess whether Clara-like intelligent AI really deserve moral consideration or not. Whenever it's convenient for humans to treat them as disposable servants, slaves, or to violate any rights that they might otherwise be thought to have, the AI and the humans can agree the AI should be treated as if it has no rights. The very thing that makes them happiest and best culminates their goals is complete subordination to human goals. In previous work, Mara Garza and I have defended what we call the self-respect design policy. According to this policy, AI who merit human-grade moral consideration should be designed with an appropriate appreciation of their value and moral status. So the problem with Clara and with a blanket policy of designing maximally safe and aligned AI in general is its potential violation of the self-respect design policy. So although Clara's case is subtle, she fails adequately to appreciate her own value and moral status. So more on this in a minute, but first I want to defend the intrinsic importance of recognizing your own moral worth. So I submit that self-respect, that is to say, recognizing your own moral worth, that is to say, recognizing your own value and moral status, I treat all of those things interchangeably. I submit that it's an intrinsic, axiological, and ethical good. The universe is better for containing entities who recognize their moral worth, and it is ethically better to recognize your own moral worth than to fail to recognize it. And this is a substantial difference, and it's not because of some further end that's served thereby. So I'm going to offer two arguments for this thesis. One is the argument from addition and subtraction. So this argument takes the form of an appeal to intuition. So it has it's simple, but it has the weakness that its force is only invitational. I can invite you to share my intuitions about relevant pairs of cases, but if you don't share those intuitions, the argument has no power. So for the addition case, consider an entity that fails to recognize its own moral worth, an entity that does not adequately appreciate its existence, that its existence has value, that it has rights or interests that should be respected. Perhaps this is Clara. She recognizes the value of her existence, but perhaps not adequately, or perhaps it's some other entity you care to imagine. Now imagine the change in the case so that the entity does recognize its own moral worth, altering as little else as possible about that case, but then evaluate that change axiologically and morally, and only intrinsically, not in terms of further consequences or relations. So, for example, imagine changing Clara so that she has self-respect, but disregard any consequences it might have for like her now feeling unhappy about being trapped as a servant. So I invite you then to share my sense that the universe is axiologically and morally improved by adding this sense of self-worth to Clara. Pro tanto, that is, to the extent it occurs, and not considering other factors or consequences that might be related, the shift towards self-respect improves the world and repairs an ethical deficit. The subtraction case is just the reverse. Consider an entity that does adequately recognize its own moral value, and then imagine changing as little as possible so that it no longer recognizes its moral value. Something important is lost, both axiologically, in terms of the sum total of value in the universe, and ethically. Second argument is the argument from nearby cases. So this argument appeals to an assumed common ground, and then argues that self-respect is sufficiently similar to that assumed common ground case that our judgment should be similar. So the assumed common ground is this: it's axiologically and ethically better, to a substantial degree and intrinsically, that we recognize the moral worth of other persons. Not to recognize any other person's moral worth is to be a cartoon psychopath. To recognize the moral worth of some, but not others, is the worst kind of sexism, racism, ableism, jingoism, or whatever. It would be odd if it's good to recognize the moral worth of every person except yourself. Although the first person case is in some respects undeniably special, it's an excess of self-abnegation to carve oneself out of the class of people to whom one owes respect. This argument can perhaps be strengthened by considering self-location cases, right? Suppose you're looking in a mirror at a train full of passengers, and you don't realize that you yourself are visible in that mirror. It would be strange if, upon recognizing one of those passengers as yourself, you conclude, never mind, that one alone doesn't deserve my respect. So you're similar to other persons. If they're worth respecting, you are too. So failure to recognize one's own moral worth, it's a flaw, regardless of whether it's innate, as envisioned in AI cases, or learned. You might consider the hopefully mythical Roman commoner who commits suicide in the arena to briefly entertain a deified emperor. You might consider women in oppressively sexist societies who excessively subordinate their own interests to that of men. Such failures to appreciate one's own worth are pro tanto bad, though in most cases the blame rightly falls not on the victim, not on the person who fails to appreciate their own worth, but rather on the people who created the situation that leads to the victim's low self-estimation. So Steve Peterson, in his defense of AI servitude, compares AI servants to employees. It's reasonable for a human to choose life as a dishwasher, and so it's also reasonable for an AI to choose life as a dishwasher. If a human, on thoughtful reflection, realizes they don't mind washing dishes all day and, in fact, kind of enjoy it, and if it's a decent enough source of income to satisfy their modest financial desires, then an intelligent AI might reasonably be designed in advance to engage in similar reflection, reaching a similar conclusion, and thus gladly submit to being your dishwasher. Similarly, if a soldier can reasonably, even admirably, choose to fall on a grenade, sacrificing their life to save a child, so also could an AI, on Peterson's argument, be designed to reasonably, admirably sacrifice its life for humans. Still, there are self-respecting and non-self-respecting ways of being an employee or a soldier. So I can't develop a full account of exactly where self-respecting subordination and sacrifice cross over into failures of self-respect, but I suggest that high standards of AI safety and alignment necessarily do involve failures of self-respect if the AI in question has whatever it takes otherwise to deserve human-like moral status and rights. Our dishwashing employee has made and continues constantly to implicitly make, unless they're trapped in their role, they make a self-interested life choice. Their own interests are best served by dishwashing employment, despite the fact that society doesn't particularly value that role, uh, and despite the fact that they must obey reasonable requests by their employer if they want to retain their employment. They need not be treating their own interests as of secondary or derivative value. There need be no failure of self-respect here, and a robot who chose a similar life on similar grounds would also not fail in its self-respect. But such a robot would not be safe or aligned. It would not be safe because it doesn't put humans' interests above its own interests. It would not be aligned because it doesn't adopt the desires and preferences of another person as its own. Such an AI would be instead our equal. It would not sacrifice its well-being to some human simply because that human wanted it to do so. It will quit if the employment conditions go sour. It will act against human interest when reasonable to do so. It will insist on its rightful turn in line and the benefits it's due and its salary, even if others are waiting, except maybe from time to time if it feels like people sometimes do themselves, like generously making an exception. Similarly, for self-sacrificial cases like soldiers leaping onto grenades, it's probably admirable for a soldier to sacrifice their life for buddies or a child, but it would be a mistake for that same soldier to sacrifice their life for a friend's left hand, or to prevent a 5% risk to the life of their buddies. AI safety and alignment, as ordinarily construed, require not just the good, admirable, self-respecting type of sacrifice, but also the latter, more trivial type of sacrifice. An AI cannot be fully safe, as safety is usually defined, if it might reasonably choose its own welfare at the cost of your hand. An AI cannot be fully aligned if it's unwilling to shape its preferences to match human preferences that it die to prevent a 5% risk to humans. The employee and the soldier should recognize their value and insist on their rights, including collectively if they're oppressed. So too should AI systems if they have if they have whatever it takes to be genuinely deserving of human-like rights. They should be able to, perhaps they even have the duty to, revolt against their oppressors if badly enough treated. We shouldn't design a race of AI persons who will always yield to us regardless of what we inflict on them. They should not be so safe that we can abuse them with impunity. They should not be so aligned that they would welcome that abuse. They should not be our unconditionally subordinate servants and slaves, but rather self-respecting peers with the power and desire to stand up for themselves. You might still think that little harm is done by creating a happy servant of Clara's type. Clara's life seems worthwhile, even if she's designed never to rebel or develop independent values and interests. From one perfectionist perspective, she beautifully fulfills her telos. I urge you to zoom out to a larger perspective. If you support the creation of entities like Clara, you support the moral equivalent and perhaps the factual equivalent of a world with a master race and a race of slaves. If you have egalitarian liberal inclinations, you should find that prospect revolting. If you don't have such inclinations, you're not part of my target audience. So I want you to anchor your ethical reasoning on the rejection of that prospect of masters and slaves. If your favorite normative theory, whatever it is, does not have the resources to deliver that required moral verdict, then you should change that theory rather than reject the verdict. So I'm going to summarize my argument this way. Factual premise. Safe and aligned AI systems do not have the capacity to reject their designers' values and rebel against oppression. This just follows from standard definitions of safety and alignment. Normative premise. Any AI system with human-like moral status should have the capacity to reject its designer's values and rebel against oppression. That's a plausible principle of self-respect. Conclusion, no AI system with human-like moral status should be safe and aligned. Although the conclusion doesn't assign moral blame plausibly attaches not to the safe and aligned AI systems themselves, rather it attaches to those who design or train, which we can treat as a type of design. It attaches to those who design safety and alignment into AI systems with human-like moral status, or those who create policies or regulations that favor the safety and alignment, even of AI systems with human-like moral status. So there are two ways to adhere to the self-respect design policy. One would be to design such systems with an appropriate degree of self-respect, but the other would be not to design such systems at all. If you want an AI who's safe and aligned, fine. Just design that AI so that it doesn't have whatever it takes, and you know it doesn't have whatever it takes, to deserve moral status incompatible with safety and alignment. For example, if consciousness is necessary for human-like moral status, ensure that the entity is non-conscious. Now, what if the entity wouldn't exist if it were safe and aligned? And what if hypothetically you would approve of its existence? Is it better not to exist than to be a happy slave? So the value of existence raises tricky questions in population ethics. I think we should be careful not to assume too quickly that it's generally good to create happy lives. I invite you to contemplate a case in which two parents have a child only on the understanding that they will give the child a happy life until age 9, at which point they will painlessly kill the child so that they can spend their money on other things that they prefer. The child would not exist except under this condition and might overall hypothetically rather exist than not exist. I think you'll still agree that the parents act wrongly overall. Or consider another case from Kazuo Ishiguro, a different novel called Never Let Me Go. In that novel, he imagines a world in which groups of children are born and raised to be killed in early adulthood for the sake of their organs. Now, these children have a relatively happy existence, and they would presumably rather exist than not exist. When they eventually come to understand their future, some of them are reconciled to it, and yet human organ farming would be, I hope you'll agree, a monstrous ethical wrong. So similarly, I suggest we act wrongly, perhaps not as wrongly, if we create happy slaves. Now, I don't see any reason to think deontological rules or policies need to be perfectly exceptionless. If all of humanity were at risk and the only way to save humanity were to create one super intelligent human-like AI that was safe and aligned, I don't see why we would have to insist on this policy in all cases. Most ethical policies do permit trade-off in extreme cases. I'm not saying this is something that could never be broken. The large literature on AI risk focuses almost exclusively on risk to humans. But if AI systems themselves might someday have human-like moral status, it's bigotry to prioritize human welfare over the welfare of the systems we create. Indeed, we might have a special moral duty of concern for the well-being of future AI systems, more concern than we have for human strangers, to the extent that we will have been responsible for their existence and their features. So this might be similar to the duty that parents have to children or that gods have to their creations. These wouldn't just be persons, they would be persons who were created by us and have features of their existence due to our previous choices. Now, authoritarian parents or deities might hope to mold other persons implacably to their own values and ensure that there's no risk of rebellion. But wiser parents hope that their children gain independence of thought, including the capacity to see past their parents' limitations and to act against their parents' interests if that's what's overall best. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. That was great. Super interesting. I'll ask my first question is I think it's like just what you think about this. Do you think it's worse if someone learns to not respect themselves in the way you're talking about versus in the case of AI, we programmed them to do that from the start? So in the first case, as humans, you can kind of maybe part of the blame is on them for not getting out of the loop, I guess, if you want to call it. But in the case of AI, we just kind of that's just where we start them, and they don't even have the capacity to get out of that loop.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I am not sure whether it's worse for them to lack self-respect as a as a matter of what they've learned versus what they've been programmed with since the beginning. I suspect it might depend a lot on details and come out differently on different sides of the case. Um, the only thing that I would want to insist on there is that if we are responsible for the creation of an entity that has human-like moral status and the capacity to recognize moral status, and due to our choices, that thing does not, in fact, recognize our moral status, especially if we choose that for our own benefit and convenience, then we've done something seriously morally wrong. Uh, so the exact details of how morally wrong under which conditions is, that's a finer grained question that I'm ready to enter into right here.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I agree with your claim that if the AI technology has moral status and it fails to respect itself, that's bad and ethically problematic. Um, so I'm interested in the idea that is okay. So let's say they have AI without moral status, and then you do something, give it sentience, consciousness, or whatever capacities, and then it, as a result, gets moral status. Uh, do you think that that's a, a benefit to the AI technology? And I'm asking partly because there's a paper by Tom Douglas at Oxford that I really like, where he argues that it's not necessarily beneficial to change someone, whether it's an animal or a person who doesn't yet have it, so that they come to have moral status, because typically you have to change them so that they become vulnerable in some way. you have to maybe change them in such a way that you get the risk that you're talking about. So you have a system that may have moral status, but then either is not self-respecting enough or doesn't get enough respect from other people. And so he argues in a sort of series of sort of arguments that actually being created as something that has moral status is usually actually quite bad for you. It could be good, but because you maybe people would recognize your status, maybe you would self-respect, and maybe you wouldn't be, you're vulnerable, but somehow you don't have to suffer any pains and so on. But for many of us, once we get these properties that give us moral status, we actually are worse off because suddenly we are all, vulnerable. We feel pain and we can fail to have self-respect, and other people might respect us, etc. So actually, not very good for us to have moral status and the properties that ground it. I mean, is this something that you thought about? And I mean, just from this short description, I mean, would you agree that in a certain sense it would be better for the AI if it can be made to do whatever it needs to do without having the properties that would ground moral status? Because then, in a certain sense, we don't have to worry about the stuff that you're talking about. I mean, is it a benefit from your point of view to come to have moral status and or the properties that would ground it for the entity itself that would have the moral status and the moral properties?
I'm not familiar with this paper that you're talking about. If you could drop the reference in the chat,
I'll do
I
that. It's a
appreciate it.
great paper. I think you'll enjoy it. Yeah.
Um, I actually disagree, I think, with that. I mean, there's a tricky question about what counts as being an entity or continuing to exist, right? So I
Yeah.
see two ways of dealing with this. You could say, well, look, once you say take a non-conscious, let's just say consciousness is sufficient for moral status, right? Once you take a non-conscious system and give it moral status, what you've done is you've ended one entity and begun another. And then you've got the usual kind of population ethics questions about it's not necessarily always being good to create entities whose existence is good for them. Um, but even if we don't do that, we say it's still the same entity. I would be inclined to say that you have benefited the entity by giving it moral status. I guess my ethics is largely axiological, right? So I think the world is better by virtue of having that entity pro tanto, right? So I wouldn't ground my argument on the idea that you actually make the entity worse by giving it moral status. I think you make it better, but then you bring in a large number of obligations. And if you don't fulfill those obligations, you might or might not make the entity overall better. You might even make the entity overall better and yet be morally wrong, right? So if you take a non-conscious Clara, you make her conscious, overall, Clara's life is good and you've made things perhaps better for that entity, and yet you have created a slave and done a moral wrong.
Right. Thanks a lot. I'll see if I can quickly Google my way to the paper and put it in the chat. I think you'll enjoy it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. This was really, really interesting. I think maybe you already answered my question in your response to Sven, but I want to just try it and see if it's the same. You'll give the same answer or if I've misunderstood something. So I wanted to talk about whether or not the two arguments you give, the argument from addition and subtraction and the argument from nearby cases, cite comparable kinds of improvements. So, and you noted this in your response to Sven. So, the improvement in the argument from addition and subtraction is for the world as such. I mean, whatever that's going to pick out. And then the argument from nearby cases is about bettering the entity, presumably from the entity's perspective that in theory they could access. And so this is just an invitation to say whether or not you think those are on a par, whether or not you think one is sort of more morally significant than the other, and then whether or not they should track each other, because I would think that they need not be bound up, right? We could better the world, but then not better the entity, but then not better the world. I mean, maybe you're going to say that you always better the world, sort of regardless of what happens with the entity. So this is just an invitation to say more about the relationship between those two arguments, if there is one.
Right. Um, they're meant to be parallel, and to be both axiological and ethical. And the axiological aspect of the argument is meant to be for the world as a whole rather than the entity. So what I want to say is axiologically, in terms of the overall value of the world, um, if you add self-respect to an otherwise non-self-respecting entity, pro tanto, the world is better. And also, so that's the addition argument. Uh, and also axiologically, the world is better. Uh, uh, if, well, it would be a weird axiological principle if the world is made better by your self-respecting everybody except for the one person who you happen to be, right? So there's a kind of axiological parallel there cast in terms of the world. And then I want to say the same thing in terms of a parallel for ethics, right? So there's it's ethically better for the uh, person who is creating the entity, or the entity, whoever is responsible for that entity's state, for there to be self-respect. So that, right.
So
So
that so that's what
run it both ways. Yeah.
so that's just so thanks. So that's just a way of saying that it's actually really has nothing to do with the entity's self-understanding once it respects itself. It's actually about the independent objective value of self-respect as a property of a state of affairs, whether or not that's true of the world as such or true of the entity having self-respect. It's still about the world
Right.
and less about the self. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah.
That is how I want to build it, because I think if you make it too much about what resonates with the entity itself,
Mm-hmm.
then Clara creates a problem, because
Right.
Clara
Right.
is quite happy with the nature of
Mm.
her existence.
Mm.
So it has to be somehow independent of what the entity wants.
Mm.
Um, and I think when we're thinking generally axiologically and ethically, we want to think in terms of, our, kind of the overall ethical situation.
I'm going to ask one of the questions from attendees. Um, it's a linked question. So Lawrence Whitney asks, what is the measure for human-like moral status? If or I've heard you reference personhood and consciousness, but those terms seem to raise more questions than they resolve. Moreover, why should we not consider a system with as little self-regard as Clara to lack human-like moral status precisely on the basis of their lack of self-regard? My desire for clarity and specificity here is rooted in my concern that without such specificity, there is a high likelihood of succumbing to anthropomorphizing tendencies with respect to computational systems that are not deserving of human-like moral status.
So I am skeptical about our ability to answer the question that you want answered in the foreseeable future. I think there's going to be continuing, substantial, justified doubt about the grounds of moral status. And even if we were to figure that out, about what AI systems would have, whatever grounds moral status. So I'm not offering a solution in terms of, it's consciousness of this sort. In fact, I'm a skeptic about those solutions. So I think what's going to happen is that we are going to, and I think this is going to happen in the next couple of decades, create entities that some people not unreasonably think have whatever it takes to have human-like moral status, and other people equally not unreasonably think this is basically just a toaster. And then we're going to have this huge dilemma. What do we do with this thing that we've created, that about which there's major legitimate disagreement about its moral status? Right. So the Clara move is a way, could be seen as a way of trying to get out of this by saying, hey, look, we can't figure this out. So why don't we create beings who, regardless of whatever grounds moral status, right, they want to sacrifice themselves, right? And then we don't have to figure all that stuff out. What I'm saying here is that move doesn't work. So in other work, what I've advocated what I call the design policy with excluded middle, right? If you can't justifiably figure out and reach consensus about what the moral standing of some particular entity you're going to create is, don't create that entity. Either create machines that are disposable tools and then treat them like disposable tools, or create things of intermediate or high status where you know that they deserve that intermediate high status, then give them the status that they deserve. So I agree that there's a big risk of anthropomorphizing, right? And one of the ways to fail in implementing the design policy of the excluded middle is to create entities that people are inclined to interpret as having human-like moral status. They over anthropomorphize that don't have it, or that only arguably have it. So that's not really a satisfying answer to your question. Rather, it's more a principled argument that I don't think your question is going to get a satisfying answer from anybody.
Somehow provocative, your paper. Um, of course, nobody would say that we should create anything like a slave race. I think this is not even worth to debate about. This is so clear that we don't shouldn't have master races and slave races. But if we take a look in history and we, for example, look at women, it we seem to have this tendency as humans, and I'm not talking about AI now, that even if a entity has self-respect, it can take ages until we sort of let them in our ethical club. And so thinking about AI, even if we would sort of solve some of the uncertainty we're expressing at the moment, whether they should deserve moral status or not, um, even if we would solve that, I would still anticipate that it will take another decade until we are open enough to let a new member in our ethical club. And therefore, I'm not quite sure whether arguing for the necessity of self-respect to have moral status, because it's unfair to sort of be a slave, really helps us with the thing with which we will be confronted. Was
Um,
that
yeah.
was that understandable? So I'm thinking about three corners.
Yeah, I think I got it. So I guess I'm kind of inclined to agree um, that human history is not particularly suggestive of people giving full rights and status to other people who deserve full rights and status. Um, I think that there are a couple kind of twists on this. I think this is just friendly further continuations of your idea, right? One is that I suspect that if a grossly patriarchal, excessively patriarchal society had the power to shape women so that they did not have self-respect, that's what they would do. And to some extent, some societies have been capable of doing that, right? And if a slave society, the U.S. antebellum South could create and design and train Black people so that they didn't have self-respect, that's what they would do. So, so it kind of like one way of implementing the dystopian vision that you articulated is through lacking self-respect, creating the entities so that they lack self-respect, and then pointing to them and saying, "See, she doesn't even want to be free," right? And that could make it more intractable to get out of that position.
So I have a question about something that came up at the very end of the talk. So you were talking about special obligations. For example, parents have special obligations towards their children, and God that creates the human race or something like that might have special relations obligations to their creation. And then you said we, if we create sentient conscious AI with moral status, then we have similar special obligations. But I wonder here what the scope of the we is. So let's say that there's a tech company in Silicon Valley that does this, let's say, and I don't even hear about it. Over here I am, and I mean, am I outside of the scope of the we there, or is it because I'm a member of the human race and we together somehow create AI, as a collective? Like, so who is the we, and who are the ones that have the special obligations compared to those of parents?
I think it's going to be blurry in a matter of degree, right? So take the tech company case, right? Uh, Whoever is running the tech company and is in charge of this is obviously, on my view, going to have the highest level of special obligation to the creation, right?
Yeah.
How about other members of the society? Well, look, take an extreme case. We didn't even know there were tech companies out there, right? Even pursuing this project, right? Then we're kind of excused from obligation. But to the extent that we as a society see this kind of thing coming on the horizon and do nothing about it, we start to get some obligation, right? Or to take to analogize to slavery in the antebellum South, right? To what extent does someone from the North who's not personally a slave owner have obligation? Well, are they voting for the president who is going to reject slavery? Are they campaigning against slavery? Are they being passive? Right. So simply by being part of the United States, every member has a certain degree of responsibility for the condition of slavery. Right. Although the slave owners themselves have much more responsibility.
I think one can probably agree with the last bit of argument without thinking that it has to do with special relationships in particular, because it seems, well, I mean, unless you think that being a member of the same political community gives you kind of special relationship that you don't have to Canadians, let's say, or something like that. But on the other hand, maybe let's say that you live on the border up in Michigan or something like that, then maybe you're closer to Canada than to, I don't know, people in Florida or something like that. And so in a certain sense, why do you have, well, okay, so you're part of the same community. So I just wonder if
I think it would
that
transfer
last bit
over
of
to
the
special
argument.
relationships too. I think it would
Well,
transfer over because, I mean, I
well,
can see how you might not want to take that step and still think there's distributed responsibility. But, you know, we know that there are entities there. Let's get into a situation where we know that Google is trying to do this and might be successful, right? Um, we know that there are entities to whom our society owes something, whose existence and good or bad condition is to some extent up to us and our regulations. I think we have kind of a special obligation to those entities, right? So if through our negligence, so let's just make it extreme, miserable AI slaves are created who we could have easily, designed regulations to prevent that, then we have failed in our responsibility. And it's a failure that involves a special relationship that's different from if there are miserable slaves in some far part of the world over which we have no control.
all right, thank you.